Fascinating, isn't it, how the very thing that should bring peace can become a source of torment? Silence. That peculiar absence of sound that most find restorative. Yet for those with avoidant attachment patterns, it transforms into a psychological battlefield. Why silence drives avoidants crazy, even if they hide it, reveals one of the most intriguing paradoxes of human psychology. You see, while avoidants appear to crave distance and independence, silence, particularly from someone they care about, triggers an internal chaos that contradicts everything they believe about themselves. Picture this. A person who has spent their entire life building walls, convinced they need nobody, suddenly finds themselves checking their phone obsessively when someone important stops responding. They tell themselves they don't care, yet their mind races with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. This is the hidden vulnerability of the avoidant. Beneath that fortress of self-reliance lies a hypersensitive alarm system that interprets silence not as absence, but as rejection, abandonment, or worse, complete indifference. The psychology behind this phenomenon is both elegant and cruel. Avoidants develop their attachment style as children, learning that emotional needs are burdens, that closeness equals suffocation, and that safety lies in emotional distance. Yet this very adaptation creates an exquisite sensitivity to the subtle shifts in relational dynamics. When silence enters their world, it doesn't register as neutral space. It becomes pregnant with meaning, thick with implications their conscious mind refuses to acknowledge, but their nervous system cannot ignore. What makes this particularly maddening for avoidance is their simultaneous need for and fear of connection. They've convinced themselves they're above such pedestrian concerns as whether someone responds to their message or calls them back. They pride themselves on their independence, their ability to function without the emotional crutches others seem to require. Yet when silence stretches between them and someone significant, their carefully constructed narrative begins to crack. Consider the avoidant who sends a vulnerable text, already a monumental achievement, and receives nothing in return. Minutes turn to hours, hours to days. They oscillate between fury and despair, between "I don't need them anyway" and secret, shameful worry about what they might have done wrong. They become detectives, analyzing the last interaction for clues, constructing elaborate theories about why the silence has descended. Was it something they said? Something they didn't say? Are they being punished, tested, or worse, are they simply forgotten? This internal experience contradicts everything avoidants tell themselves about their emotional landscape. They're supposed to be the ones who disappear, who need space, who value freedom above connection. Yet here they are, consumed by the very thing they claim not to want: acknowledgement, response, proof that they matter to someone else. The silence exposes the lie they tell themselves about their self-sufficiency, and this exposure feels both terrifying and infuriating. The psychological concept of reactance plays a crucial role here. When avoidants perceive that their freedom to connect, even minimally, is being restricted by someone's silence, they experience an intense drive to restore that freedom. Paradoxically, this makes them want connection more, not less. The silence becomes a barrier they suddenly feel compelled to break through, even though connection usually makes them uncomfortable. It's as if the universe has played a cosmic joke on them, making them crave exactly what they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Today, we'll explore this fascinating psychological labyrinth, understanding not just why silence affects avoidance so profoundly, but how to navigate these treacherous waters with wisdom and compassion, whether you're an avoidant yourself or you're trying to understand one. We'll delve into the stories that reveal these hidden truths and, more importantly, discover practical ways to transform this vulnerability into genuine connection and growth. Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect in his 40s, who prided himself on his emotional independence. For 20 years, he'd built a successful career, maintained casual friendships, and enjoyed relationships that never went too deep. He was content with his carefully orchestrated life until he met Sarah, a woman whose quiet confidence somehow slipped past his defenses without triggering his usual retreat response. Their connection developed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Coffee conversations that stretched longer than planned, work emails that contained subtle personal touches, moments of unexpected vulnerability that surprised them both. Marcus found himself genuinely looking forward to her messages, though he'd never admit this to himself. He maintained his protective stance, keeping things light, never reaching out first, always maintaining plausible deniability about his growing attachment. Then came the silence. After months of daily interaction, Sarah simply stopped responding. Not dramatically, not with explanation or conflict, she just faded away. Her last message had been warm and engaging, full of the subtle intimacy that had been growing between them. Marcus had responded with his typical measured warmth, perhaps holding back more than usual because he'd been feeling too much, too fast. The first day, Marcus barely noticed. He was busy, important projects demanded his attention, and besides, people get busy. By the second day, he caught himself checking his phone more frequently, though he dismissed this as coincidence. By the third day, the silence had transformed from background noise into a presence in itself, thick, oppressive, demanding interpretation. What happened next revealed the hidden emotional architecture that Marcus had spent decades concealing, even from himself. His mind, usually sharp and logical, became a conspiracy theorist's playground. Had his last message been too cold, too warm? Had he revealed too much in their previous conversation, scaring her away? Or worse, had he revealed too little, boring her into indifference? The silence triggered what psychologists call negativity bias, that ancient survival mechanism that makes our brains assign greater weight to potential threats than potential pleasures. But for Marcus, with his avoidant wiring, this bias became amplified and twisted. Every possible explanation his mind generated seemed to confirm his deepest fears about relationships, that he was too much trouble, too difficult to love, too fundamentally flawed for genuine connection. Yet even as his mind spiraled through these dark interpretations, Marcus found himself experiencing something unprecedented: anger. Not the clean anger of logical frustration, but the messy, complicated anger of someone whose emotional needs have been activated despite their best efforts to remain detached. He was furious at Sarah for disappearing, but more furious at himself for caring. This anger revealed something profound. Beneath his careful indifference lay expectations he'd never acknowledged, hopes he'd never dared to name. The psychological principle of reactance manifested in fascinating ways. Marcus found himself wanting to reach out to Sarah more intensely than he'd ever wanted connection with anyone. The silence had created a barrier, and barriers, especially unexpected ones, trigger our desire to break through them. But his avoidant programming warred against this impulse, creating an internal tension that felt like being torn in half. Days turned into weeks. Marcus constructed elaborate fantasies about running into Sarah casually, about crafting the perfect message that would seem spontaneous while actually being calculated to restart their connection. He rehearsed conversations in his mind, conversations where he would appear entirely unaffected by her silence while somehow conveying that he'd noticed it. The energy he spent on these mental gymnastics would have impressed Olympic athletes. What made the experience particularly tormenting was how it contradicted everything Marcus believed about himself. He was supposed to be the one who needed space, who disappeared when things got too intense, who valued his autonomy above all else. Yet here he was, obsessing over someone else's absence, desperate for a response he was too proud to directly request. The silence had revealed a truth he'd spent 40 years avoiding. He was human, vulnerable, and capable of genuine attachment, despite his best efforts to remain invulnerable. The climax came 6 weeks later when Sarah finally reached out, explaining that a family crisis had consumed her attention completely. Her message was warm, apologetic, and clearly indicated that their connection had meant something to her too. But instead of relief, Marcus felt a complex mixture of joy and terror. The silence had awakened something in him that couldn't easily be put back to sleep. The recognition that he was capable of needing someone, of being hurt by their absence, of hoping for their return. This story illuminates the cruel paradox of the avoidant experience. The very independence they cherish makes them hypersensitive to any sign that their minimal connections might be threatened. The silence doesn't just represent absence. It represents the possibility that they might have been wrong about their own emotional landscape, that beneath their carefully constructed autonomy lies the same human need for connection that drives everyone else. Understanding why silence drives avoidance crazy requires recognizing that avoidance isn't truly about not needing others. It's about protecting oneself from the vulnerability that comes with needing others. When that protection fails, when silence pierces through their defenses and reveals their hidden attachment, the resulting internal chaos can feel overwhelming. They're not just dealing with someone else's absence. They're dealing with the collapse of their fundamental narrative about who they are and what they need. Now that we understand the emotional landscape that makes silence so challenging for avoidance, let's explore practical strategies for navigating these treacherous waters. Whether you're an avoidant yourself or you're in relationship with one, these approaches can transform a source of torment into an opportunity for growth and deeper connection. The first crucial step for avoidance is developing what I call silence literacy, the ability to read silence accurately rather than filling it with catastrophic interpretations. This begins with recognizing that your brain, shaped by attachment experiences, has been programmed to interpret ambiguity as threat. When someone doesn't respond immediately, your nervous system activates as if you're facing actual danger, flooding your system with stress hormones that make clear thinking nearly impossible. The key is creating what psychologists call cognitive space between the trigger and your interpretation. When you notice silence from someone important, pause before constructing elaborate theories about what it means. Ask yourself, what are 3 completely mundane reasons this person might not have responded yet? Perhaps they're busy with work deadlines, dealing with family obligations, or simply forgot to reply. Training your mind to generate neutral explanations counteracts the negativity bias that automatically assumes the worst. This practice requires patience with yourself. Remember, your avoidant adaptation served a purpose. It protected you from disappointment and rejection when you were vulnerable. But that same protection system now creates suffering where none may exist. Developing silence literacy means gradually rewiring these automatic responses through conscious practice and self-compassion. The second essential strategy involves what I call productive action rather than rumination. When silence triggers your anxiety, channel that emotional energy into meaningful activities rather than letting it cycle endlessly through worst-case scenarios. This isn't about distraction. It's about recognizing that your brain needs something concrete to focus on when it's activated by uncertainty. Engage in activities that require genuine concentration and provide a sense of accomplishment. Work on projects you care about, exercise intensively, create something with your hands, or learn a new skill. The goal is giving your activated nervous system a constructive outlet while your rational mind regains its footing. This approach serves multiple purposes. It prevents you from spiraling into destructive thought patterns. It reminds you of your own competence and value, and it often leads to insights about the situation that weren't available while you were anxiously obsessing. Physical movement deserves special attention here. When silence triggers your attachment system, your body becomes flooded with stress chemicals that were designed to fuel fight or flight responses. If you don't metabolize these chemicals through physical activity, they continue circulating, maintaining your state of emotional activation. Regular exercise, particularly activities that require focus and skill, can dramatically reduce the intensity of your response to others' silence. The third strategy addresses the reactance phenomenon directly. When silence feels like a restriction of your freedom to connect, you'll experience an intense urge to break through that barrier immediately. This urgency rarely leads to skillful action. Instead, develop what I call strategic patience, the ability to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Create a personal protocol for handling significant silences. Perhaps you wait 48 hours before sending any follow-up communication, giving both yourself and the other person space to respond naturally. If you do reach out, make it genuinely helpful or interesting rather than demanding acknowledgement. Share something valuable, ask a thoughtful question about their interests, or offer support if you know they're facing challenges. This approach accomplishes several important things. It prevents you from appearing desperate or clingy, it gives you a sense of agency in the situation, and it often reestablishes connection more effectively than direct confrontation about the silence. Most importantly, it helps you practice tolerance for uncertainty, a crucial skill for anyone with avoidant tendencies. The fourth strategy involves building what psychologists call earned security through conscious relationship practices. This means deliberately challenging your automatic assumptions about what silence means in your relationships. Instead of interpreting silence as rejection or indifference, consider it an opportunity to practice secure relating. Start by having conversations with people you trust about communication preferences and styles. Many conflicts arise simply because people have different approaches to response time and communication frequency. What feels like rejection to you might be completely normal to someone else. These conversations require vulnerability, which challenges your avoidant tendencies, but they also provide the clarity that can prevent misunderstandings. Practice expressing your needs directly, rather than expecting others to read your mind. If you value prompt responses during certain situations, communicate this clearly rather than assuming others share your preferences. If someone's silence is causing you distress, consider sharing this honestly rather than building resentment. This directness feels terrifying to avoidance, but it often prevents the very rejection you're trying to avoid. The fifth strategy focuses on developing emotional regulation skills, specifically for uncertainty. Avoidants often struggle with the discomfort of not knowing where they stand with others. Building tolerance for this uncertainty is crucial for reducing the intensity of your response to silence. Mindfulness practices, particularly those focused on present moment awareness, can be remarkably helpful. When you notice yourself creating stories about what someone's silence means, gently redirect your attention to what you actually know versus what you're imagining. This isn't about suppressing your concerns, but about distinguishing between facts and interpretations. Journaling can also provide powerful insights into your patterns. Track your responses to silence over time, noting what triggers the strongest reactions and which coping strategies prove most effective. Often you'll discover that your worst fears about what silence means rarely materialize, giving you evidence to counter your negativity bias in future situations. Finally, consider the possibility that some silence in your relationships might actually be healthy and necessary. As an avoidant, you value independence and space. Extending this same courtesy to others can reduce the pressure you feel when communication lapses. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent, but rather developing appreciation for the rhythm of connection and separation that characterizes healthy relationships. Working with a therapist who understands attachment theory can accelerate this growth process significantly. They can help you identify the specific triggers that activate your attachment system and develop personalized strategies for managing these responses. More importantly, the therapeutic relationship itself provides a safe space to practice new ways of relating and to experience the security that makes other relationships less threatening. The transformation from seeing silence as torture to viewing it as simply another aspect of human relationship requires patience, practice, and self-compassion. Remember that your avoidant adaptation developed over years or decades. Changing these patterns takes time and consistent effort. Each time you respond to silence with curiosity rather than catastrophe, with patience rather than panic, you're rewiring your nervous system and creating new possibilities for connection. As we reach the end of our exploration into this hidden world of avoidance psychology, I want you to consider something profound. Your sensitivity to silence, rather than being a weakness to overcome, might actually be a doorway to deeper authenticity and connection. Yes, the pain you feel when important people in your life become quiet reveals your vulnerability, but it also reveals your capacity for genuine attachment, a capacity you may have spent years trying to deny or minimize. The avoidant individual who recognizes their hidden need for connection and learns to navigate it skillfully possesses a unique combination of independence and depth that can enrich all their relationships. You've already developed the ability to function autonomously, to think independently, and to maintain your sense of self even in close relationships. Now, by acknowledging and working with your response to silence, you can add emotional authenticity and intimacy to these strengths. Think of Marcus from our earlier story. His experience with Sarah's silence, painful as it was, ultimately revealed possibilities he'd never imagined for himself. He discovered that he was capable of caring deeply without losing himself, of being vulnerable without being consumed, of needing someone while remaining whole. The silence that initially drove him toward despair ultimately drove him toward greater self-awareness and emotional capacity. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without conscious effort. But every time you choose to interpret silence with curiosity rather than catastrophe, every time you reach out with generosity rather than desperation, every time you sit with uncertainty without creating dramatic narratives, you're building what attachment researchers call earned security, the ability to form healthy relationships despite early programming that makes connection challenging. For those of you who love someone with avoidant tendencies, remember that their response to your silence reveals the depth of their hidden attachment to you. When they seem angry or distant after you've been uncommunicative, they're not being unreasonable. They're having a profound internal experience that contradicts everything they believe about themselves. Approaching them with patience and understanding during these times can create opportunities for unprecedented intimacy and trust. The practical strategies we've discussed, developing silence literacy, channeling activated energy productively, practicing strategic patience, building earned security, and cultivating tolerance for uncertainty, aren't just techniques for managing difficult emotions. They're pathways toward the kind of authentic, satisfying relationships that make life meaningful. Each skill you develop in response to the challenge of silence becomes a tool for deeper connection in all areas of your life. I encourage you to begin this work today, starting small and building gradually. The next time someone important to you doesn't respond as quickly as you'd like, pause before creating explanations for their silence. Generate 3 neutral possibilities, engage in meaningful activity while you wait, and respond with generosity rather than defensiveness when communication resumes. Notice how these small changes affect both your internal experience and the quality of your relationships. Remember, the goal isn't to become someone who doesn't care about others' responses. That would be moving backward toward unhealthy detachment. The goal is to care skillfully, to need others without being controlled by that need, to remain open to connection while maintaining your essential autonomy. This balance, difficult as it is to achieve, represents the pinnacle of emotional maturity and the foundation of truly satisfying relationships. Your journey from being driven crazy by silence to finding peace within uncertainty is not just personal healing. It's a contribution to the world around you. As you develop these skills, you become someone who can offer both independence and intimacy, someone who can be trusted with both closeness and space, someone who demonstrates that it's possible to need others without losing yourself. In a world full of people struggling with their own attachment challenges, this is a gift of immeasurable value.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.